Well, hello, welcome, bonjour, guten tag, bon dia, howdy, good day. Welcome back to our Regcast. The wait is over. Today we're talking about WAN optimization, or if you wanted to put it another way, why buying bandwidth isn't always going to work for you. So my name's Tim Phillips, and as you know, and it's my job first of all, before I introduce my guest, to just take you through the interface that you've got today. A lot of you will know it, but we're going to try a little sort of interactive adventure. Yeah, it's like those sort of workshops that you really hate when people say, let's all just work together on this one. So first of all, the first tab that you'll see is for questions, and we're going to do a little poll here right at the beginning. We want to ask you, are you thinking about buying some more bandwidth in the next, let's say, 6 months? It's a yes or it's a no. If there's a yes, just put a few words about what you're going to buy it, why you're buying it. You don't have to put a lot. We've got quite a lot on in here already, so we can't read a lot. But it would be nice to get your feedback straight away so I can put your concerns to our panel. The other things you've got there, a download. If you want to download the presentation, have a look at it after, or have a look at it in a different window while we're talking. The speaker bios for if you want to know about our guests, and also the feedback for later. And as we always say, do tell us what you think, because then that makes it better the next time we come round. We hope so anyway. But first of all, while you're doing that, and I hope you're filling that in, I want a yes or a no, and that means you as well, Mr. Person, who's doing his emails on his BlackBerry. Let me introduce the people who are presenting today. So from Riverbed, who are experts in this kind of thing, we have Mark Lewis. Mark, welcome.
Hello, Tim. Great to be here. Thank you.
Okay, great. And from our old mates, Freeform Dynamics, we have a man whose bio won't tell you, has sacrificed a lot to be here today. He gave up a career in professional football. He became an analyst, and he even moved to Germany. Tony.
Thank you, Tim. Wonderful welcome.
Okay, great. Well, what we said. Okay, so we've got already the results are coming in. Keep them coming. But first of all, maybe someone could explain exactly what WAN optimization is. Mark, that's one for you, I reckon.
Yeah, very happy to. So, if we look at WANs and wide area networks as they are today, really what we're looking at doing is taking the wide area network and enabling it to perform like a local area network. And if we can achieve that, you can start to imagine the possibilities of distance and barriers of bandwidth and latency, which is one of the biggest issues, and we'll talk more about that later, becoming no longer an issue, but something that we can start to achieve some interesting things, which we'll cover in the course of this presentation.
I mean, it might be a silly question, but why do we need a WAN to work like a LAN?
So that's a very fair question, not a silly question at all. Today, the wide area network interconnects billions of transactions worldwide, and it's tremendous that it's organised and managing greatly. But as we see this exponential increase in storage, as we see people no longer working from a single location, but actually operating from many locations, the need to access more and more information means that for IT managers and CIOs, it's becoming more complex, and the headache is becoming bigger because they're trying to manage very large, growing environments, and they're more complicated. If we can centralize those, and instead of just consolidating within the data center, but look at consolidating to the data center, we can start to simplify the infrastructure that's being deployed. And that's what WAN optimization looks to achieve for many organizations today.
Tony, is the business driving this, or is this just a nice to have?
No, it's absolutely being driven by the business. The sort of research work that we carry out with your registered readers here, we get a lot of feedback from those people on what they're doing at the moment. And they tell us all the time that certainly saving costs, always a big issue, but increasingly people are looking at optimizing their infrastructure so that they can deliver services well to their customers at a good price, but with excellent levels of service, irrespective of where those people are located. More and more they're trying to do consolidation projects, partly driven by cost again, but also to help them raise security levels and be better able to manage everything that they have, know what they have, where it is, and make sure that it's always accessible to users. So the research that we carry out with your readers, with the viewers out there, tells us that these are projects that are genuinely being undertaken by people today. And Not always directly, but certainly indirectly, they are finding that there are challenges to doing that, many of which are actually inherent in the speed of light and the nature of the protocols that are used to actually connect everybody together. We sort of accept today that everybody can be connected together wherever they are, but that's not always the case. They can be connected, yes, but whether they can be connected well so that the users can use the service effectively, that's the challenge for many people. And that's where they often come across the need for these sort of solutions.
Well, let's look at some of the areas in which this tends to break down, because I know that you've got 3 areas here, Mark, that you pinpoint.
Yeah, sure. So the kind of 3 typical conversations that we would have, or the 3 types of groups that we may discuss things with, are maybe the networking people to start with. And they're concerned with things like bandwidth and latency. And am I able to accommodate all of this data that's going across my network? And now they're putting voice and video down the network. So those are kind of some of the concerns of the networking people. The second audience that we talk to often are the application people, that they simply want the applications to work for the remote users, whether they're in the same office, in a different office in the same country, in a different country, or even on their laptop somewhere else in the world. And the final audience of the 3 audiences that we often speak to are the storage people. Now, the storage people have different concerns. They're concerned with data sprawl. The storage is growing, as we talked about and mentioned already, exponentially, but it's also growing in many, many different places. Every time a new data center opens, often every time a new branch office opens, and sometimes storage comes in under the radar. That is, somebody locally may decide to purchase storage and thinking it's okay, and then as it grows, want to hand it over to the IT department. And behind our people and our customers, the data is probably the 3rd most important asset. So the storage people are obviously responsible for that. And those are 3 different areas that we often have discussions about. And in some environments, particularly smaller organisations, of course, that can be the same person. And I'm sure many people watching today will be somebody saying, actually, I deal with all of these things. And that often happens as well.
The interesting thing as well is that for those people that do everything, the archetypal IT manager, and I was one once a long time ago, the issue that you get thrown at you more often than not by the end customer, and it did take me 6 years of interpersonal skills trainings to call them customers as opposed to something else. The biggest response you get from those is always to do with the response time of the application. It's running slowly. Yeah, that's always the thing that generates the most calls to the help desk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm judging by some of our early responses that we got here. Thanks for those. We have one of your typical IT managers here. Yeah, networks cost me a stink, and I need to cut my costs for sure. Tell me now, tell me quickly. You have to wait about another 45 minutes to get the full story, but we will promise to tell you exactly how. But a lot of people just basically saying they need to roll out new applications, they need to increase their bandwidth because they increase the utilization of what they've got already. That constant problem that they're always having to buy more and more, isn't it?
Absolutely, and the research we're carrying out shows that despite the current economic climate, projects are being undertaken. The business always wants something new, but obviously at the lowest possible price. So the idea that we are rolling out new things all the time, Mark mentioned voice and video increasingly coming in. Clearly they put demands on the network, they put demands on the infrastructure in all sorts of ways, but projects are still being undertaken. IT life is going on.
Well, now here is, because here also we do have the problem of a recession. I think many of our viewers will have realised that there's one going on by now. And certainly from this research that you did, IT budgets are under pressure.
IT budgets are always under pressure, frankly. That they have been probably since about 2000, 2001, just after the year 2000 explosion in IT budgets. IT's been forced really to justify everything that it does. And at the moment, that's simply carrying on. As we can see from the chart here, there's quite a number of people saying that they expect there to be either, pretty catastrophic impact, but that's a relatively small number of organisations, or, some cutbacks across the board, both in IT, but more generically in business as usual. The thing here is that people do realise that as well as being a cost, IT is actually now being looked at to help address some of these larger business challenges that are part of the economic climate. You know, how can we be greener? How can we save money by being greener, so save power and electricity? How can IT help us address these global macro effects, so that, you know, it's not everywhere that budgets are being cut. There are still people whose budgets are going up, but that's pretty much the way the research that we've carried out with the register readership over the last 2 or 3 years has shown us. There are always companies where the IT budgets are increasing. There are always companies where the IT budgets are being decreased. This year there are more where the budgets are being decreased compared to last year, and there are fewer where they're being increased. But IT life is going on. There is clearly pressure out there. That IT cost pressure will not go away anytime soon.
Mark, just to get this straight, I mean, looking at this slide, you know, we've divided it into corporate, mid-market, SMB. WAN optimization, it's a corporate thing only?
Absolutely not. No, it's something which we've seen examples in many different organisations, from the largest government agencies throughout the world to some of the smallest charities, which have actually deployed this technology with just a handful of sites. And one example in the UK, a charity, the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, for example, they saved something in the order of £17,000 a year, which to many of the people listening today might not sound a lot, but it was 25% at the time of their overall IT services budget. And we've had other organisations where they've saved somewhere in the magnitude of $500,000 a month in bandwidth alone, and others with estimated productivity gains of $980,000. So we range from the very secure, very particular government environments to the very small charities to the very largest. It really does spread the spectrum of all organisations, and as referring to this chart, from the SMB to the mid-market and corporate. And we do have many more examples, and there are many examples of WAN optimisation deployments in each of these areas.
Okay, well, let's have a look in a little bit more detail about what we're actually talking about with WAN optimization, what it's going to mean for different types of applications. So this slide's got a lot of things listed. Can you make sense of that for me, Mark?
Yeah, let me try and put this into a digestible format. So IT directors, CIO IT managers today, they're possibly looking at 3 core things. And if we look at the different areas of what IT is looking to achieve, first of all, they're trying to improve productivity of employees. Secondly, they're continually looking to save costs. And finally, they're looking at mitigating risk, often associated with data, but there's data center recovery in other areas. So in each of those 3 areas, there are people today, and obviously with what you've just mentioned, the current economic climate, which is not growing as fast as it perhaps has in recent times, many people are looking to the centre of this chart. But each of those areas has different solutions and a different approach. And WAN optimization is a technology which is still relatively young, let's not forget. It's been around since really the early part of this millennium, I should say. You know, 2002 we started to see some people, and it started to come together as things moved on. But whether the people tuned in today looking at this are actually saying, yeah, I want to increase my productivity, or actually I want to mitigate some of the risks, or as your gentleman actually wrote in obviously quite more directly earlier, I want to save costs. It can be one project in any of those areas that typically sparks off a WAN optimization project. But when you deploy WAN optimization, it's not then you have to deploy another load of technology within our WAN optimization to see benefits in other areas. It's just that one area that is the project starter, and you'll start to realise benefits in other areas.
Yeah. As Mark said, it really is people find a trigger that causes them to look at WAN optimization. It may not always be an obvious trigger, as we'll talk about a little later, but there's a trigger that makes people undertake projects and from which they find that they can address many different areas. And one thing that we've found over time is that the idea of productivity gains are something that there's quite often a lot of talk about, but it's really difficult for IT organisations and business generally to actually quantify anything. It's much easier to come up with a project that's based on cost savings or at least cost avoidance. But the productivity gains, potentially are always going to be there with this sort of solution. And they could almost slip under the radar, the benefits that they deliver to people in terms of people just working more, being more flexible in where they work from, with mobility being a big challenge for lots of organisations today.
But here's the thing, I talk to carriers quite often, and they've been repositioning themselves over the last few years as service providers. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the service that they've got to be providing is making your network work better for you. Why are they not taking care of this?
Well, that's a very good question, because they are. They are actually embracing this as much as many organisations themselves. So you go from a complete do-it-yourself, we manage everything internally, to a totally outsourced. And then there are many mixes in between. And WAN optimisation is being employed and deployed by each of those areas. So let me give you some examples. An organisation that manages its entire infrastructure is really taking its ownership for ensuring that the overall service level agreements, that the budget costs and everything is adhered to, and it works stringently. One step in the direction of outsourcing might be an MPLS network, and many people do ask, does WAN optimization work if I'm running an MPLS network? And the answer is yes, absolutely, it's fine in that scenario. And actually what it can do is control what travels across that network and the efficiency with which it travels across that network. And so people see advantages. And then at the other extreme, as you alluded to with the service providers, they just want to remove the whole headache and actually just look after and deploy a service. And the only thing the end users and the IT people are interested in is it delivering the service as agreed? And what WAN optimization does is it allows the service provider organizations to deliver the service levels. And it's really a kind of a big step towards cloud computing, because people now no longer worry where the service is, where it's deployed. They don't mind whether the servers are stored on their location managed by a service provider or whether they're stored many thousands of miles away. All they're interested in is, am I getting access to those services? And this is the technology that enables and gives them that ability to achieve those kind of results.
One thing I'd like to add here is that you're talking about service providers as if, they are singular entities and that they all operate in the same way and that everybody inside of that service provider has the same goals. Mm-hmm. And clearly, most service providers are pretty big companies. Yeah. And like all pretty big companies, there are a lot of separate islands of operation within them. Some people for whom their objective for being will be to sell more bandwidth. So clearly for some of those people, getting their head around WAN optimization may not be an immediate first step for them to take. But certainly the service providers as a whole can see genuine benefit in this from many different perspectives, particularly as they are trying to become, as you said, genuine service providers rather than just, fat pipe providers. Because the margins, if nothing else, on providing good managed services are usually better than delivering any form of commodity product.
Yes,
but it takes time for organisations to change, and some individuals within them can change more quickly than others.
And it's quite an alluring sell that they have, isn't it, to be able to say, okay, we'll sell you 3 classes of service. Mm-hmm. We'll sell you some very reliable, very fast stuff for these applications. We'll sell you some not so good and some rubbish stuff as well. By rubbish, I'm paraphrasing. I would have never made it as a salesman, but that's basically it. And that's a very simple sell. Does that solve all the problems?
Nothing solves all of the problems. But WAN optimization can certainly help address many of the business challenges, and there's some of the things that we're about to move on to.
Right, yes. Now tell me, specifically, should they have a WAN optimization project, or does this come in as an aspect of other things?
So maybe if I can just take that, because if we go just have a quick look at the slide again, we can see in the blue there are 4 key areas that people who've tuned in today may have tuned in for. It could be that their applications aren't operating as they'd like them to for their end users. It could be that they've actually had a success with a consolidation project within the data centres, but they want to reduce the number of data centres, or more importantly, maybe they're looking at building another data centre. They don't want to invest in that infrastructure. Perhaps bandwidth is an issue, as we've talked about, or maybe disaster recovery is a project. Typically, it would be one of those areas that people would be looking at to get these started. And those are the kind of things that we would see people start to work on. So can it solve all the problems? It has a very broad potential of addressing problems, WAN optimization, that is, of course. But do we want to try and address all those problems at once? No. It's kind of too big a step all at one time. It's worth taking one step at a time and looking at a particular project. And it's the pain point, the biggest pain point that people will be feeling at the moment that will give them the biggest benefit. And the biggest benefit is obviously the one that will be most easy to sell into the business. And once it's proven itself, then you can start to extend and expand that out. And that's what we've seen with many of our customers. About 50% in the WAN optimization market see repeat business, because once they've deployed it, they realise the benefits it brings, and they start to extend it from the larger data centres to the branch offices to the smaller branch offices, and so it continues to grow within organisations.
It's one of those things, people love to have grand strategies for the acquisition of infrastructure, but nobody actually buys according to a strategy. People buy tactically. So what's the pain that we have today? What can help fix it? That justifies the budget for doing something. And then if there are collateral benefits, which certainly in the case of WAN optimization, there's very likely to be, then you can see a ripple effect as it spreads out beyond that initial, here's the pain, solve the pain. Oh, look, it can also help us with this, this, and this.
So what are reg readers saying that their pain points are for when we're talking about problems that can be helped by WAN optimization?
Well, on the downloads that people can get of the slide decks here, there's a couple of slides in there showing the current projects and initiatives that organisations have in mind at the moment. And top of the list there is this general infrastructure optimisation. Some of that's wrapped around the server consolidation side that we've seen many projects being undertaken over the course of the last 2 years, almost all of which have been very much targeted at limiting the cost of growth in IT budgets to help people get more from what they have. And we're seeing a lot of that going on, and indeed there are still very many projects being undertaken today. So that's a major area that's freeing up
Before
budget.
we move off that one, tell me, how exactly does WAN optimization help in that, for example? What would it do? How would you do it differently?
One of the scenarios that Mark's highlighted here is that today there are servers all over the place. They've been put close to where the end users are so that those end users, when they hit the enter key, they get a response time back that's acceptable to them when they're using the application. What companies want to do, for a whole variety of reasons, of which cost is simply one and the most obvious, is consolidate the locations where they have these servers to make them essentially easier to manage. That the biggest cost of managing your IT infrastructure isn't actually buying the servers in the first place. It's running them over their lifetime and managing them over their lifetime. So if you can pull all of those servers that may be in each of the branch offices, or sometimes even in the offices of your partners and things like this, if you can pull them all back into the centre, then you can make significant costs on the actual server infrastructure itself by having fewer, bigger servers that are more cost effective to run, actually use less power to make them work, and less cooling wrapped around that. So the whole cost issue there is very persuasive. But also the fact that you don't have these servers now dotted around, potentially half a day's drive away for one of your IT guys to go out and routinely maintain, can save you essentially a lot of money over the lifetime of those projects, with the proviso that you obviously still need to be able to deliver services to those end users at a speed that's good enough for them to carry on doing their business.
So we're saying that potentially by consolidating servers but not paying enough attention to response times, you might be solving one problem but giving yourself another.
It has happened. We've certainly seen evidence that has happened.
Okay. Any other applications at the moment that are hot buttons for WAN optimization?
Big one is the general mobility in the workforce. Organisations are trying to provide more flexibility for where their people work. Possibly they have people working from home for certain times of the day. In the past, there was some reluctance often on the part of line management because they thought that when people were working from home, they maybe weren't working at all. They were just taking the day off. Whereas, frankly, over the years, a lot of research has been carried out that indicates that when people do work from home, they usually work for longer than when they're in the office, and they're more productive than when they're in the office. So a lot of that initial reluctance to provide that flexibility on where people work from has gone away because there's actually good business benefit into it. Never mind some of the sort of softer green issues. They're not travelling and commuting, so that's good. But also, in some countries, there's a degree of central driving from government to make organisations provide better flexibility for their workers. Beyond that, there's always the case of travelling salesmen, people moving around, people working with their partners. So mobility generally over the course of the last 3 years has exploded. 4 years ago, the number of people with laptops was still relatively small. Today, the number of people with laptops who think that they can use them to still access those central systems, irrespective of where they are, has gone through the roof. So we're seeing more and more people doing mobility. And as you can see from some recent research on the register here, it's a major issue across the board, from the very smallest of companies to the very largest. In fact, interestingly enough on this slide, if you look at people with current projects in the smallest size of company here, and those planning initiatives in the next 6 months, there's actually more of them in the very smallest of companies than even in the very big ones.
And it's fair, but it
It's
is the
spread across the
majority.
board.
It is
It's
the
everybody.
majority for
Absolutely.
everybody here. But it's one thing I don't really get with latency at the moment is you're talking about replacing latency that's pretty good with latency that might be much better. If people are having problems with their applications or they're having problems with application delivery, let's use that example, then isn't improving your latency a little bit going to have a very small effect?
Well, I think it's a kind of a fair assumption that you're coming up with, because if we look at typical latency across the country like the UK or anybody nationally, we're talking about 40 milliseconds. Now, I know we've all got very busy schedules, but I think most of us have 40 milliseconds time slots free.
I have a lot of time free.
Between the UK and the US, we could be looking at anything like up to 100 milliseconds. Slightly wider window, but nonetheless, it's not too bad. And if we're using satellite communications, it's something like 750 milliseconds. Now, sub-second times doesn't sound a lot, and I think most of us can afford to wait on that. But if we look at not in real terms at what that latency is, but what that means to an application, and let me use the example of an Excel spreadsheet, a 1 megabit Excel spreadsheet. And let's say we were sharing that file across a wide area network using Microsoft Common Internet File System, as an example. If you had a client and a server and you wanted to share that file, not a relatively large file, a small file, it would take you somewhere in the order of 976 round trips, roughly speaking, before you could actually get that file completely downloaded. And if you start to multiply the 976 round trips by the 40, 100, whatever millisecond latency, you start to see why the file is really slow. It's not a bandwidth issue, it's a latency issue. And if we then say we're not just sending a few megabytes a day, we're sending a few hundred megabytes a day, and often many terabytes a day, then we can start to see, and we multiply that problem across latency. Suddenly you see the significance of latency. How do we address latency, or what do we do? We're basically talking about the speed of light here. So how do we conquer the speed of light? Well, the only way to really conquer the speed of light is to not make the trip in the first place. And that's what WAN optimization is really addressing. It's eliminating the unnecessary trips. It's giving all the acknowledgements and everything that applications need to maintain their security in knowing that everything's well, but it actually takes it off of the wide area network and puts it into the WAN optimization devices. And that applies to appliances that may be deployed in data centers and branch offices. And as Tony was just talking about, the mobile workforce as well. So it could be a notebook, it could be a PC. It may not be a mobile device. It could be somebody sat at home, as we talked about the home workers, with a mobile WAN optimization software. And even it could be a partner company. So let's just take a large organization such as Boeing, who's actually deployed a lot of wide area network optimization and is looking at that in the mobile. They have actually, as you can imagine, got lots of partner companies as well, because when you build an aircraft, which is a relatively large project, it's not all coming out of one company, it's many different companies, all needing access to files, to drawings. It's a massive collaboration project. And so by deploying mobile to your partner companies, they get all the benefits of WAN optimization, even if they're not in the same organization themselves. So these benefits stretch from the largest to the smallest in terms of actual clients as well.
So to get absolutely clear, to get the benefits of WAN optimization, if I'm, for example, working from home, I would install some software. I would be given some software to install at home.
Yeah.
And that
so
will optimize the link.
Exactly right. So typically you would have an infrastructure in place, a WAN optimization infrastructure in place. And then if you wanted to deploy to mobile workers, what you would then do is you would actually then deploy this software on the mobile people. And typically in a WAN optimization, you don't pay a license per user, because you're sat here chatting to me, which is a very enjoyable time, I must say, but you're not actually on the network at any point at the moment. So while you're off the network, one of your colleagues could be using that license. So it works on a ratio where you can deploy the software to as many users as you like, but you just buy the licenses of how many concurrent users you'll be using. But back to your original point, you're absolutely right. It's a simple, almost a zero-weight bit of software that just sits on a device.
And at the other end, what are you actually deploying? Because there's a couple of people asking that, saying, what's the device?
Okay, good questions. What you typically have is to optimize across the wide area network, you have devices at each end of the network. And it works like a hub and spoke. So in the data center, you have a very large device. And then in the remote offices, you have smaller devices. And they vary depending on the traffic, the profile, etc., which we can work with customers on. Then what you would do is if you wanted the mobile software, you have a mobile controller that does all of the checking the licensing. It then checks the versions of software and it issues the license, and it works in conjunction with your VPN, and then it can push out, and there are two modes, what we call visible. We're getting quite detailed now. Visible or invisible. In visible mode, as a user, you can see what's happening on your laptop. As invisible, and most IT organisations like this idea, the people don't know that it's happening, which means it's happening in the background, which also means they can't interfere with it. And it's something which gets deployed on a laptop device, and mobile workers can then access files from their central store, whether they're based in London and their servers are in London or New York or San Francisco or Hong Kong, as though they were almost in the same office. So it's a real big benefit to many organisations, because a lot of the files we want to work on, we don't have to have on our laptops anymore. And this really has a whole collaboration story and a working together and ensuring we're all working on the same files.
It really plays into that productivity element that was talked about earlier, that customers often find it really hard to justify, but frankly that's where the real value comes from. You know, doing things that previously you couldn't do or contemplate doing because they were either too difficult or too expensive. And that's where businesses make money, make new money, as opposed to just saving costs.
And another question, do you work closely with the carriers? Because, as Tony pointed out, you're taking business away from them. They make money by selling bandwidth. And you're saying, well, maybe you don't need to buy it.
No, and I think that the carriers would probably admit these days that money from bandwidth is less of an issue for them. You know, they recognise that services, and you've talked about the outsourcing, is where they're really seeing their revenue streams from. So what they're working towards now is delivering the best value they can for their customers, and they're looking for technology that can enable them to do that. And it's technology such as the WAN optimization technology that can give them that differentiation. So we're not killing heavily the bandwidth opportunity that they are so reliant on. What we're doing is we're enabling them to deliver a much better quality of service to their customers through the services that they want to deliver. And they have actually embraced this technology, and we're partnering with many service providers globally at the moment whom we're actually working in tandem. And just to give you an example of that, there was a press announcement a while ago where BT and Riverbed are working in tandem, and there are others as well that we're working with around the globe.
And frankly, there's absolutely no end in sight to the demand for new bandwidth, because people are doing more and more over the network. We talked earlier about video and VoIP, and to a degree they're still pretty juvenile in their wide-scale deployment, and they will put more pressure on the availability of networks. So whilst the WAN optimization helps you make the best of what you've got, it doesn't mean that you're never going to need more. It simply puts off perhaps the time at which you'll need to purchase that, to put it more in line with the needs of the business when you actually pay for something. So the telcos don't need to worry that demand for new bandwidth is going to evaporate overnight just because of WAN optimization. What we're saying is that it lets people do more. Get more bang for the money that they're spending, to get much better value from what they're doing. And frankly, most of the service providers recognise that if they don't help people make the best of the service that they've built their entire operations around, then somebody else would do it for them. And as Mark said, they really do recognise that it's the value-added service that's the future of the organisations. It takes time to change cultures inside businesses, but it is happening. But changing people takes time.
Now, there's another question coming in here based on this our mobile worker conversation. Over 3G, can you improve the stability of their VPN connection? Because they're saying that the latency over the WAN is causing their VPN reliability not to be as good as it should.
So we'd need to have a closer discussion and look at that to see what's actually happening there. So I can't comment on that specifically. But
this
to give
is
you an
the
example
sort of work.
3G, yeah. I mean, I travel around Europe, Middle East and Africa, and I have a 3G card in my laptop, and I will often access files in San Francisco on my 3G card, and these would be quite large files, and obviously we're using a VPN as well. So absolutely, this is something which we work for, we deliver, and there are specific optimizations when dealing with 3G that are different than when you're on a local area network to your laptop or when you're on a wireless network. And we have these subtleties, or there are subtleties, I should say, built into WAN optimization devices that we deploy. So absolutely, yes. And I think in terms of the specific issues that that customer or that person has just responded with, that warrants further conversation. But it's something which is not outside of the ordinary for us.
How automatic is that? How much do they have to get involved with the optimisation, or is it something they can leave to happen?
Yes. So we need, obviously, pass the purchase order and the initial deployment of the actual device itself. As far as a user is concerned, it just happens. You know, it's an invisible technology. And years ago, we used to talk about the internet, and the question with the internet is, when will the internet become successful? And the simple answer back then is, when it's invisible. You know, you don't want to think about the plumbing, you don't want to think about the connecting to the servers. And today we've reached a point where the internet is invisible. You turn on your browser and you just expect it to be there. And it's the same with WAN optimization. Yes, there's a little bit of infrastructure to install if it's the IT department or if it's outsourced, but more and more we're seeing that becoming less of an issue. But as far as users are concerned, there is no consideration. It's completely invisible to them. They just see the benefits. Which is often what happens. And in fact, in many of the trials that our customers have, we have people where they very rarely get compliments, IT departments. I'm sure that many people today will recognise that.
Did you ever get one, Tony?
Absolutely not.
But they'll be the first to receive the complaints. And we had a customer a while ago who put it on and couldn't believe the results they were seeing. And they went to take off the WAN optimization technology, and everyone complained, and they plugged it back in. And they were so surprised, they thought maybe it was just a freak or unlucky, so they took it off again, and everyone complained, so they plugged it back in, and it was a real proof case that it was delivering as they thought it was.
It's a good job it worked when they plugged it back in, wasn't it, really? Yeah.
Well.
And just and one more question while we're dealing with this, just to clarify, it will work within, if people have classes of service, you can still use WAN optimization within that.
So classes of service, we're talking about quality of service, QoS
Quality of
markings.
service, yeah, different.
Absolutely. So if we're looking at WAN optimization, if I may, just from Riverbed, for example, at the moment, we have QoS markings within the appliance, but, and I think this question, the customer's saying, or the person's saying, we already have our own marking and our own quality of service. Will you honour that? Yes, absolutely. We will honour the markings and the quality of service that people have on their networks.
It's steady on, they're not a customer yet.
Well, it's interesting that the whole area of measuring the quality of service as delivered to that end customer is something that's really just beginning to penetrate into mainstream business.
Yeah.
In the past, when IT has had some form of quality of service relationship with its customers, it's been very much based around, you know, our applications are going to be available 8 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock in the evening, Monday to Friday, etc. So it's been more about availability and uptime, and very little to do with, you know, how fast am I actually going to be able to consume that service when I hit the enter key. We're beginning to see that form of end user response time monitoring and quality of service measuring in a way that means something to the business user. Rather than in the traditional IT metrics becoming more and more into play. And we're seeing this from a lot of research that we're carrying out, again, with the register readership out there, where we're seeing a much closer alignment by IT to get service delivered in a way that makes sense to the business and that the business actually appreciates that it's being directed towards their needs. And so this is something that we're going to see more and more requests for, to actually look at that overall measuring of the service delivered to the end user and making sure that it's appropriate. What appropriate might mean is one thing. Potentially it could involve things like chargeback, again, so that IT can show the level of service it's delivering in respect to the costs that it's spending to deliver that service to. So it's going to happen more and more.
Okay. Now, Mark, explain this graph to me.
Okay, yeah, happy to. So if people look at the chart that's on the screen, if it's in front of them now, they can see that the demands on IT is a white upward-looking curve, which would perhaps look familiar to many people. And for each of the register readers and people that are tuned in looking at this, it possibly is a slightly different story in terms of what makes up that curve, but nonetheless, the requirements are going up. So it could be things such as storage, it could be they need to consolidate data centres, it could be they have a responsive time that's needed, better responsive time, more applications, lots of things. And we're effectively looking at budget here. What we then have is where the budgets actually are today. And the budgets today are either not quite as expected because of changing economic times, it could be they're flat, or maybe in some cases we are seeing them potentially declining. But whatever the reason, the gap between the requirements and the budgets is an increasing gap. And I think, as Tony mentioned almost near the beginning, was that, you know, it's always a challenge, the budgets, even in economic good times. So what we have today is there are a number of discussions and a number of technologies and ideas that we're hearing and reading about lots, like virtualization, green IT, consolidation, web apps. And these are all going some way to actually improving the IT effectiveness. But if we look at deploying WAN optimization, what does that actually mean? What can it do to people? Well, it takes all of these great ideas, adds in a few more, and has what we term the riverbed effect, or if you want to be kind of fairly broad, the WAN optimization effect. What does WAN optimization do for your environment? It gives you an effect which is far more than you would perhaps otherwise expected. And so, you know, the budget that we freed up through all the cost savings, it doesn't give you extra budget. I just want to add that to the readers. That's not what we're saying here. But what it has done is it's closed the gap between what the requirements are and the budget that you have to deliver those. And for some organisations, this is great news because they've started to close the gap on their worrying declining budgets. But for many organisations, it's not just about reducing spend because they don't have the budget. It's actually enabling them to increasing spend in incremental value for the business, because IT is also often seen as just a cost centre that is just trying to simply keep IT going, and it's looking to add more and more value to the business as it starts to see more seats on the board and actually starts to drive a change in the way business operates. And this is really what we're talking about with these two slides.
It's interesting that we are finally beginning to see a different appreciation of IT within businesses, so that it's beginning to move away from just being that cost centre where everything goes wrong and we spend money and we never get real value from it. So that at the moment, as we talked about earlier with the current economic climate, businesses are looking for IT to actually help them do more, to become more productive as an organisation, not just genuinely to make IT more productive. So we are seeing, perhaps for the first time really in IT ever, a real appreciation that it's more than just the necessary evil, that IT can and really does help the business. If we'd have asked business managers 10 years ago, could they survive without IT, they'd have probably scratched their heads and said, yeah, well, it'll be painful, but we can do it. Now, very few people think that. If IT isn't working, as is always the case, then those phones, get red hot very quickly. People recognise that, and they expect IT to be there and working, but increasingly they're expecting it to be able to help them to do more things, to do new things, to really generate business value. And that's a change that's really sort of just crept in almost subconsciously over the course of the last 2 or 3 years.
One thing that isn't marked on this graph is security, and we had a Regcast about it not so long ago, and a lot of people are very concerned about this. If you're consolidating servers, doesn't the riverbed effect here mean that more data is being sent over the WAN? Doesn't that have an effect on security?
Not at all, no. In terms of addressing security, I would never kind of state that riverbed enables security in an organisation. There are organisations that are much better set up to obviously address security. And I think what we're saying today is that actually most of the data of an organisation does traverse the wide area network, but not as much as perhaps it could. And if they could make better use of the wide area network, then that would obviously give them other values that we've talked about. We also work in partnership with many companies who do deliver security and make sure security is a part of the IT infrastructure. So that would be a separate thing. However, just wanted to kind of qualify that we're not saying we're a security company. There are many security concerns. And there are many things within WAN optimization that you can enable and allow security. So, for example, the devices, the appliances, have disks to store reference and information, and you can have encryption on those disks. You can use encryption for data that's sent across the wide area network. We have policy-based management for people who have administration rights, and we can have different levels there. And it goes on. There's a long list of many security elements we have. And if an organisation has enabled security, let's use SSL as an example, where people have said, right, we have SSL, surely you can't optimise that, because the very nature of security is you take a bit of data and you secure it. Well, we have a unique patent pending technology that actually enables people to optimise SSL traffic without breaking the trust model. And there's a long discussion around that, but we certainly take security seriously. We work with partners who are good at delivering security for the wide area network, but it is something which it is not compromised at all when deploying wide area network technology.
If I could add something here, security is much more to do with people and process. And one thing, again, that our research has shown time and time again is that if you have all of the elements in your infrastructure in centrally managed locations, then it's frankly much easier to make sure you've got the right processes in there to secure them in the first place, rather than if they're disparately spread throughout the organization. When systems are spread all over the place, we often find that people don't know what's out there. They don't know what data's kept on machines. In branch offices, quite often branch offices are located in less than salubrious locations, and strangely enough, servers do go missing. PCs go missing. They get stolen. They disappear out of the business completely. So if you have an infrastructure where you have consolidated, and it's a secondary driver beyond cost that lots of organizations have recognized, that it's easier to secure things when you operate in this centralized model. It's another of those factors that's really pushing the central consolidation of servers and storage back into the middle from spreading them out close to users. Security, it's much easier to implement well in a centralized model than in a distributed model. That's experience shows that, even if research hasn't actually asked exactly that same question. But you go and ask any IT manager, they'll tell you that if you've got everything under your control centrally, it's much easier to make sure that the computer room door's locked. If it's in a cupboard in a branch office somewhere, anything can happen.
That's good. It's a good point about the SSL, because we had a question specifically about that, where someone was very concerned about that. Let's look at this. The process of how you solve your WAN problems.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think of the whole conversation that we've had for the last 46 minutes, this is like the nuts and bolts. So for those who are on the who tuned in and are kind of saying, okay, so how? At a very quick level, there are three basic root causes of issues across the WAN optimization. We have touched upon them in the conversation, but let me just go through them. The first one is bandwidth limitation. You know, we are restricted by bandwidth. It's becoming much cheaper, and there's more of it available. But we're seeing more and more remote workers. We're seeing more requirements on the data center to back up information, and we're seeing more global organizations. So there's higher bandwidth demands there. And let's not forget that people are now putting their voice and their video down the data networks. What we fundamentally do is we take out anything that's repeated. Once we see a bit of data, not a file, but the actual data, and we've sent it across the network, any time that file or that bit of data is repeated, we simply send a reference. So the presentation that people have been looking at today in the bottom right-hand corner and the bottom left-hand corner has logos that will be repeated on every slide. That's bits of data represented by data. Once we've sent it once, we would replace it by references. So this can reduce what we call the first time information by something like 65% on a cold pass. On a warm pass, it's up to 90%.
Cold pass and warm pass?
Yeah, so a cold pass is the first time we've seen the data.
Right.
So we're learning about it. And we look for repeat data within a file. A warm pass will be the next time you see that file, 100% is clear. This is where we can start to talk about deferring bandwidth upgrades by up to 5 years, because we have just zapped nearly a majority of the data going across that wide area network. But what we haven't done at this point is we haven't really made anything go faster, unless in a rare situation you do generally have a bottleneck on your wide area network. So as we start to look at accelerating, let's look at the transport chattiness. Now the transport mechanisms of TCP, it's kind of like the vehicles that transport the data. Because we are terminating the TCP session, which is the transport layer, and replacing data with references, we're effectively restuffing a TCP packet with references that represents many megabytes of data. Now what does that mean to the layman? Well, basically each TCP session now carries and represents many, many megabytes. That means fewer TCP sessions, which addresses the biggest problem of wide area network, which we talked about earlier, which is latency. So with the bandwidth restriction and the transport protocol restriction, we started to accelerate everything that runs over TCP. But the real pièce de la résistance, the kind of the finesse to the whole game, is the application chattiness. And we've already used Microsoft CIFS, but NFS, it could be SQL Link. There's a whole range of applications that actually have a lot of chattiness across the wide area network. We simply eliminate that, and those conversations happen on the local area network. And by doing so, we restrict that chattiness across the wide area network using fewer TCP sessions and using much less data. And it's because of this that we start to talk about the wide area network performing like a local area network. And this is where WAN optimization has its play. And there's one final piece to the jigsaw, and that is, if you do all of this stuff, but you've just made my network so complicated, I don't know how to manage it, it's actually added more resource than I needed before, then you've undone all that goodness. The idea is it's got to be simple to deploy, and we can get them out of the box and up and running within 15 minutes, actually not just us, our customers. But let's not understate that there can be some very, very complex environments out there that obviously need a lot more configuration and involvement. And that's fundamentally how that the RIOS, which is the Riverbed Optimization System, addresses WAN problems and is often what's seen in WAN optimization.
It's one of those things that people really don't look at the technology that's being used. Everybody accepts the internet and TCP/IP. We just say the words and think it's life, the universe, and everything, to paraphrase Douglas Adams. But it wasn't really designed for the way that we're using it now. So Mark used an analogy when we were talking earlier about this movement of data across the internet. So instead of packaging up your information in transit vans and moving it between London and Birmingham, so that to move all of the information you have, you might have to send your transit van up to Birmingham, empty it, come back, get more data, go back, etc. 20, 30, 90, 100 times, maybe 1,000 times. You package it up into an articulated lorry. So you only have to make maybe 3 or 4 return trips rather than several hundred or several thousand. That's where the real savings come in that response time thing.
Now let me skip to this one because I want to make sure we've got enough time to talk about what people practically do here, because again we've got a bit of a few people asking about this. When you're talking about assessing the needs here, what should they be looking at?
It's basically finding those pain points that potentially are causing you challenges today. Is it that you're about to do just a bandwidth upgrade? Perhaps before you undertake that, you might want to say, well, why are we doing this? Mm-hmm. Is it genuinely that we're pulling more and more services on there? Or could potentially we be doing some things differently? So it's like all major IT projects, it comes down to finding out what you're doing and why, what the pain is that you're really trying to address today, and then find out if there's a solution that helps that. Certainly if you've got problems over the network or challenges on the network, or you're looking to buy new bandwidth alone, then it's probably worthwhile taking some time to just assess whether something like WAN optimization can help meet the needs that you're looking at and maybe save you money and actually make things better in ways that you hadn't even considered. So work out where to start first. What's the pain that's making you tune in today?
Yeah. Mark, is there a telltale sign that means that I know I have a problem?
Yes, so if there's kind of taking WAN optimization as a general kind of space, if I was a customer, I'd look at, am I looking to increase my investments currently in remote branch offices? Am I close to actually needing to upgrade my bandwidth and increase the bandwidth? Or am I looking to deploy applications closer to my end users? These are all big cost items. And WAN optimization could be something that's worth looking at, particularly if you've got these things coming up, because I'm sure most of the people tuned in today don't have a budget item marked WAN optimization. So leveraging from those is the first step. Once they've identified that, I would probably, as a second phase, start to look at a simple return on investment. And there are a number of tools out there which are available to people at the moment. There is one available on the riverbed.com website you can download, amongst others, and start to look at, if I were to remove this infrastructure, what kind of cost savings could I start to make? If you then start to build a compelling case, then it's worth evaluating the market, look at what's available, seeing what's out there, and having a chat with your WAN optimization vendor. I strongly recommend Riverbed be one of those vendors, of course, but that would go without saying. But quite simply, I would then, at the third or fourth phase, then start to look at a real live trial. Because whatever people say on paper or on slideware, it's only when you actually get the devices running for real that you can genuinely see what's going on. And that would be my biggest recommendation.
Is this something you can put in, rip out pretty easily?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the beauties of this technology, and we do this time and time again, is we have what we call a 30-day trial. So people can install the equipment, they write out a PO for the equipment, but we won't actually cache the PO. And if within the 30-day trial it doesn't do what it says, or it's not delivering the value they wanted, they just say, Riverbed, come and get your stuff, it's not what we need, and we'll come and collect it. I have to say that rarely happens, but it's a great chance for them to try it without any cost, apart from obviously the manpower.
There's two people asking, how do you compare yourself to Cisco and Juniper?
Okay, so that's obviously very detailed questions, and I'm sure that many people would like me to go into great depth. If I was to say what differentiates Riverbed from its competitors, rather than trying to take two people on hand in hand, there's two key things, perhaps three. The first one is the simplicity to deploy. You know, the most of our customers, when they do trials, they take on Riverbed because it is the simplest and the one they like to deploy. The second thing that I would say kind of ranks us above the competition is the breadth of applications. How many different applications can we actually support versus the competitors? And then the final thing is the scalability. You know, ask these vendors how many 100-site or multi-100-site deployments have they got? And if you're thinking, well, I've only got 10 or 20 sites, ask for how many 10 or 20-site deployments that they've got. Those are three things that I would very proudly say differentiate Riverbed from the competition. And anybody who is interested in understanding what we do, you know, we'd obviously have more of a one-to-one discussion. But that's what I'd say is kind of a high-level response to that.
Yes. Now, someone also is asking here about they want to optimize the performance of their web servers, and those are web servers that are going out to the public. Can they put their WAN optimization technology in between their web servers and the ISP, for example? Will that have any effect?
So it's very much an architectural question. If you have somebody who is on a web page trying to get access to a file, you won't see the optimization. The optimization, WAN optimization, has to be at each end of the network. However, what some service providers have is they may have their web servers in a different continent. You know, it may be they're in India or in Singapore or in New York, but the service delivery is in London. So what they would do is they'd have them over there, they'd use the WAN optimization technology to bring them to their point of presence in London and then deliver locally. So instead of incurring the international latency, they would only incur the national latency. And there are many benefits that people could have in that environment.
Now, we only have a couple of minutes left, but I'm going to give you a chance back with one or two of your users if you wanted to pick them out. Still a couple more questions from people who don't believe this is good for small companies.
Okay. So I've talked a lot about, well, I mentioned earlier about the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. There are many small companies and small environments that we've deployed in. And in fact, if you look at the organisation, we have something like over 5,500 customers worldwide. And I can assure you a majority in terms of volume of those customers are small to medium enterprises, because it's a sweet spot. It's something where these guys actually see the real benefits. Revenue, obviously the larger organisations have big deployments. So I would really encourage these people to talk to Riverbed, have a look at the website and see what case studies are there, because there are many small environments. If I had kind of the closing, just to pick a couple of case studies here, Alstom is great. We've talked about branch office consolidation, and that's what these guys talk about. CSX is a good example where the rail company deployed Steelhead because they wanted to get the application closer to the users.
Steelhead's your name for your...
Steelhead is the name for our appliance, yes, apologies. Boeing is a great example of mobile users. We've talked about that. One area we haven't touched on, and I know we're kind of in the closing minutes, but I just want to mention, so let's just say we've deployed Steelheads, we've moved everything centrally, we've got all these mobile workers running. To kind of coin an English expression, all our eggs are in one basket. What do we do now? Well, we're looking at secondary data centres. And if we've got two data centres, how does WAN optimization work there? Well, it's still the same devices, but it does adapt slightly differently than the way it would before. And Citigroup, in an example here, using SnapMirror, their replication went from 23 hours to 2.5 hours. So we can see a big difference. And the actual Steelhead appliances, or the WAN optimization devices, actually switch the way they operate to deal with very, very high volumes of data. So we've got the different scenarios there.
I was going to say, on that storage replication side, it's something that most small businesses haven't really been in a position to exploit because they don't usually have multiple data centers. but there's a slow growth in service providers, managed service providers actually providing off-site data replication scenarios. And again, the big fat pipe might let you do that eventually, but it might take a long time to do it. And I've talked to customers using managed storage services that have had challenges actually getting it to work in time so that they can just do business. Whereas with something that accelerates that movement of data across that wide area network, they can actually make it achievable and doable. So they get much more security into their data that they never had before, except maybe by putting things on tape and taking the tape off-site to the bank to store there, which is slow, cumbersome. Has a role still, absolutely. Tape is not dead by any means. But it's just this gives another level of service quality that maybe needs to be integrated in there that small businesses haven't previously had a chance to exploit.
Guys, we're about out of time now, but there are still a bunch of questions that are quite specific questions, which which we haven't had time for now. There's a few people sending in questions about their specific problems and things. Can I promise them that you'll answer them?
Absolutely. We will take those from you and we will get back to those individuals and have a discussion and answer those questions.
It was a good job. The answer was yes, seeing as I actually on camera, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You have it here in person.
All right. What's yes? Well, our hour is up, and so thanks for delaying your bandwidth purchases for an hour, and we hope we've given you something to think about. By the level of response, I think we probably have. But send us your feedback anyway. Let us know what we've done well and what we haven't done well. And we'll try and keep improving for next time. But for this time, thank you very much, Tony and Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
And this has been a Regcast. Goodbye.